Hello again, my name is Ray Mossy. We're doing this video because of the coronavirus attack that is now known as a pandemic that produces COVID-19, and most of the people know what those things are. The virus that causes COVID-19 is called SARS coronavirus 2 because there was a SARS coronavirus 1. This is a different virus, as we've seen in the media and so forth. The disease that this coronavirus produces is called COVID-19. And that COVID-19 is an acronym for the coronavirus infectious disease that started in 2019. So when you say COVID-19, you're basically talking about the sickness that is produced by that SARS coronavirus 2. So now this video is not intended to diagnose or recommend treatment in any way, shape, or form. It is purely for educational purposes and based upon my opinions. It is not necessarily the opinions shared by the medical community at large or the international organizations such as the World Health Organization, Centers for Disease Controls in the United States or any other countries. These opinions are mine and mine alone. You can take them or leave them, and this is simply a message that I wanted to put out there for people to consider, because at this stage of the pandemic we don't have a lot of information from the scientific community yet because studies are still ongoing, but there are studies that have been done in the past that has given us some information to work with that may be helpful in the battle against this COVID-19 disease. So first of all, if you look at the literature, and I've done a bit of research and reading to determine what it is that's going on with this virus. And there is some evidence that this virus is a man-manipulated virus. I don't believe it's man-made. I believe that they took an already established virus, perhaps a bat coronavirus, and they manipulated it to add structures to it that would make it more accessible to infect human cells. They're saying, as I understand it, that this is coming from bats in China, but there's at least one study that I know of that looked at the infectious ability of this SARS coronavirus 2 and how it infected human cells versus bat cells. And because it's no longer the native virus that they started with, they manipulated it and added proteins to it, the spike protein and so forth, as I understand it. And so this virus now does not even infect bat cells, it infects human cells. So it's no longer the native virus that it started with. And there's some evidence that this virus was created back around 2013, something like that, because there is a paper that was published, as I understand it, in 2015 reporting this gain-of-function virus that they did work on there in the United States. And now we're faced with this virus, and how it got released into the world we don't know, but I suspect, based upon what I've read, that it was released either intentionally or accidentally, but I believe that my opinion is that it was released intentionally. And not only released intentionally, but it was allowed to spread intentionally. And if you look at the progress of the thing, you can see and follow how it has carried on in the world. You can see how it was released and how China covered up this virus and the effects of this virus and allowed it to spread around the world. So I believe that was an intentional thing. But be that as it may, the bottom line is it's out there. We have to deal with it now, and what is it that we can do to potentially mitigate the infectious nature and the progression of the disease once a person gets COVID-19. So if you look at the research is showing that this virus can attack virtually any cell in the human body. So it's not just a respiratory virus. The SARS stands for Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome virus. And so this is not just a respiratory virus as it was thought in the beginning. Now we know this thing can attack the central nervous system, the intestinal system, and so on and so forth. Even can get into the skin and what have you. So anywhere that is carried by the bloodstream, it can attack those cells. And predominantly it enters into the cells by what's called ACE2 receptors, but there are other mechanisms that it can enter into cells by. And there is evidence that it even gets into the bone marrow and can attack blood cells that are produced in the bone marrow, including platelets. And so the platelets are the part of the body that assist in coagulation, and because of the malfunction of the platelets and so forth, this thing causes blood clots, not just in the veins and the main veins like other deep venous thrombosis, we call it in medicine, but it can cause microclots in the arteries, small arteries, capillaries, and venules. So this really is a very destructive form of process that can shut down or damage any tissue or organ in the body. So basically what happens that causes people to get severe or even critical forms of this illness is that it attacks various different parts of the body, but especially the lungs, and where the oxygen is exchanged in the lungs and the bloodstream. So it causes people not to be able to get enough oxygen. So one of the forms of treatment has been, from the beginning, to treat people with oxygen, possibly pressurized oxygen, or even a ventilator. And so initially people were saying that, oh, we need ventilators to support people, but they found that by the time a person got on a ventilator, if they were on a ventilator, it was difficult to get them off, and many people died once they got onto ventilators. The good news is that approximately 95+% of people will survive this disease. About 80% or so will have a mild to moderate form of it that will never cause them to have to be hospitalized or to have any sort of intensive care treatment. But even the 80% of people who get the mild to moderate form may have prolonged symptoms, or they may have what are called sequelae, or residual symptoms, for we don't know how long. There are people who developed post-infection headaches and various other things, people who have lost their sense of smell and sense of taste and months ago, and it's never come back. So these things, residual sequelae we call them, are things that people may have long-term or even permanently. We don't know yet because it's too early in the game to tell. So what you want to do is try to mitigate this disease as much as possible to at least prevent it from progressing to a severe or critical form, because the severe form will occur in about 20% of people, and of that, about 5% of the total amount of people infected, roughly, is estimated will get a critical form and could potentially die from it. So the risk of death is generally somewhere around, estimated at 2 to 4%, as I understand it. But still, that's very high compared to, say, the flu, which is in risk of death in most cases is less than 1%. So it's many times more deadly than the flu. And it was thought initially that it would be similar to the flu, but now we know it's much more deadly. And it's also very infectious. That means that it doesn't take a lot of virus, apparently, to give the person infection. And it seems that the level of infection may be related to the amount of virus that the person is exposed to. So it's better to get a small dose of the virus and have a milder form of the disease than to get a big dose of the virus that can multiply and spread rapidly into the body before the immune system can shut it down. So what we want to do is to look at the things that potentially cause the severe or critical form of the illness that increases the risk of death. And when this severe or critical form of the illness takes place, it's usually somewhere after the person has had the virus for a few days, and then when they turn bad, it gets bad very quickly, and sometimes people can suddenly die from it, having not had such severe symptoms. So we don't know exactly how this thing progresses, because there's not enough scientific evidence, autopsies being done and so forth, but we do know some things. And one of the things that we know is that this virus attacks the bloodstream and blood vessels to cause these clots. And the clots can be big clots that can, say, form in the leg, break off from the veins of the leg, go to the heart and lungs, and somebody might demise from that. It's what we call a pulmonary embolus, where the blood clot blocks the flow of blood from the lungs to the heart. From the heart to the lungs. And so that can be a sudden event, and that can happen with many diseases, but in this particular case, this virus causes blood clots. So one of the things that is being said is that people who come into the hospital should be treated or considered to be treated with blood thinners, such as heparin. And it's probably better to use a higher dose of heparin than the normal low dose that we give people for long surgeries and things to try and prevent blood clots. So again, that's still up in the air, and people are still arguing about that, whether it should be done or not. But my point is, why let it progress to that point? Why let it get to a point to where you need to be hospitalized and have heparin? The other thing that this virus does is it causes an overreaction from the person's immune system, where they develop what's called a cytokine storm. Cytokines are chemicals that are released from the immune cells in terms of communicating with other cells and so forth. They do various different duties, but there's a group of chemicals called cytokines, and when they're released in large amounts due to an overactivity of the immune system, then they can cause the body to basically have malfunction, especially in the lungs and so forth, and they can get what's called acute respiratory distress syndrome, ARDS. And there are a couple of different versions of the ARDS in the COVID-19 disease, and there are different ways to treat those two different versions. So I won't get into that, but the bottom line again is we want to prevent that. We don't want someone to progress to the severe or the critical form of the disease. So how do we stop that? Well, you need something to mitigate or control the cytokine storm or potential cytokine storm, so the overactivity of the immune cells can be quelled with steroids, such as dexamethasone. And so there's some evidence that that can be helpful, and people have recommended that for the more severe forms. But some people are saying, rather than to wait for it to become severe, to take the Medrol pills, Solumedrol pills that are available through prescription only, to try and mitigate that cytokine storm before it happens. So as soon as the person is aware that they have COVID, some people are suggesting that they take Solumedrol tablets in order to prevent the overactivity of the immune system. They also have recommended that aspirin can mitigate the thrombotic component or the blood clot forming component of the disease, because aspirin tends to cause platelets to be slippery and not actually stick together. And the effect of aspirin, fortunately or unfortunately, can last up to 10 to 14 days until you get new platelets in the system, because once a platelet is exposed to aspirin, it's a permanent effect for that platelet until it passes away. And it will have to be replaced after about 14 days. So when we do surgeries on patients, we tell people, not to take aspirin for 10 to 14 days before the surgery, because it can cause them to bleed excessively. And not everyone can take aspirin. So some people have trouble with their intestines, their stomach. They may have indigestion, that sort of thing. They may not tolerate normal aspirin. So they can take a form of what's called enteric-coated aspirin, or the brand name is Ecotrin. That can also be taken by many people. Some people are allergic to aspirin, so if they're allergic to aspirin, then maybe they could take something else, such as ibuprofen, that will not work as well as aspirin, but it may be helpful and beneficial. Acetaminophen or Tylenol or Panado, depends on where you are, the name of the medicine, is not helpful at all. It's not anti-inflammatory, and it does not affect the platelets. It helps with pain, but that's about it, and fever. So if a person's taking acetaminophen for fever and pain, that's not going to help to mitigate the progression of COVID-19. You need something that's going to shut down the virus and the effects of the virus. And the only thing that is really able to do that, according to what I've read, is aspirin. Aspirin has 3 effects. It has a direct antiviral effect, so it directly blocks the ability of the virus to replicate. That's number 1. Number 2, it has an anti-inflammatory effect. So it's going to help to quell the inflammation that leads to the cytokine storm, potentially. And the third effect is that it is an antithrombotic, or a blood thinning type of effect, to prevent the formation of those microclots and potentially even the big blood clots that have been damaging organs and killing people. So some people recommend a combination of the Medrol and a low-dose aspirin, and they recommend that those be taken together, especially the Medrol in the early stages of the disease, and the aspirin as the disease progresses. But my personal opinion, and this again is my opinion, it's not for treatment or recommended treatment or whatever, you can take it or leave it, but my personal opinion is that aspirin is the better way to go, and not to take the Medrol. I believe that aspirin, because aspirin has an antiviral effect that is dose dependent, it needs to be taken in higher doses than what is recommended to prevent blood clots. You only need a small amount of aspirin to potentially prevent blood clots, but even that effect can be dose dependent. So it's better to take a higher dose, and the dose of aspirin that I recommend people to take would be at least 500 milligrams twice a day, 2 to 3 times a day, to help mitigate or prevent the infection, even potentially as a prophylactic measure. And then if a person does develop symptoms or does prove to be COVID positive, to increase the dose of the aspirin to 1 gram 2 to 3 times a day. That's what I believe in the future we're going to see as a potential treatment to mitigate the progression of COVID-19. You cannot stop it. Social distancing, lockdowns, all of that stuff is not really going to be effective. You need something to help the body, because your own immune system is the answer to this disease. But because the disease is so rapidly progressive in some people, and we don't know why that is, but my suspicion is that people who get vaccinations, such as the flu vaccine, their immune systems are so hyped up that when this virus hits, that predisposes them to the cytokine storm and the more acute form of the disease. That's the reason I believe that the older population is dying from this more regularly, because they are the ones that are targeted, and the flu vaccine is pushed on them. And even healthcare workers, you see them getting sick more quickly and so forth, because they get the flu vaccine. I don't recommend vaccines of any sort that are not oral in nature, and that's a whole nother talk. But the vaccination for COVID is not going to be the answer, and they're trying to push these vaccines on people, and there's a hidden agenda for that, I believe, and they just want to cause people to be sick and to die for no reason. So I don't recommend vaccinations of any sort if they're not oral vaccines. And only oral vaccines will stimulate the immune system from the tonsils down through the system the way it's supposed to. When you get an injected vaccine, it bypasses the normal immune system response, and it does not produce a proper immune response. And so, in my opinion, people who get vaccines, they're getting mercury and all kinds of other stuff shouldn't take them. That's my opinion. So people who've gotten flu vaccines, I believe their immune systems are hyped up and they're predisposed to the cytokine storm. And so people have a history of taking flu or other vaccinations. Perhaps the Medrol is a good idea. I haven't determined that yet, but there's someone here in South Africa who wrote into the paper yesterday and said that his protocol, which is the Medrol and the low-dose aspirin, has been used on 300 people, and they've all survived. None of them have been hospitalized, and none of them developed a severe form of the disease. So I also believe that these sorts of approaches can work. My personal opinion is that the aspirin is a better way to go. And again, it's dose dependent, so if someone can't take aspirin, maybe they could try the Medrol and possibly ibuprofen or something like that to prevent the blood clots. But aspirin to me is the answer, the solution to COVID-19. And again, this is not intended for anything but educational purposes. Go out there, do your own research, read the evidence. There is evidence in the literature. The experts have spoken, people who know much more about it than I do. I'm a plastic surgeon by training, so I'm not an expert in virology, and certainly my opinion is usually cast aside because of the fact that I'm not a real doctor in most people's eyes. But I do understand these processes, and I have also seen people who have taken aspirin when they got the disease early on, and usually within 24 to 48 hours their symptoms abate and they never progress any further than just mild symptoms. So catch this thing early on and deal with it as you see fit. And again, this is purely for educational purposes, not intended to diagnose or treat or recommend any treatment for this. But I'm of the opinion that the answer to COVID-19 is aspirin. So we'll see as time goes on if this indeed is how COVID-19 will be shut down. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this video. If you enjoyed it, please click the like button and subscribe. And if you have any questions or comments, feel free to contact us or put them in the comment section. Again, thank you very much for listening, and God bless.